of the roles we perform as game masters is being the arbiter of the rules. No matter how complex or encompassing the game mechanics might be, there will always be situations that the rules will not cover. Can the spell create water, fill someone's lungs with water? Can you summon a shark inside a water elemental? Can an unseen servant cook? And these are just the ones I had to deal with in the last week. On the one hand, these are legitimate questions. On the other hand, we don't want to stop the session and have a discussion every time one of these situations pops up. So, how do we handle cases where we need to make snap rulings on the fly? Let's start by distinguishing a few instances where we will need to make rulings mid-session, when we are not familiar with the specific rule in question, when the rules themselves are unclear or ambiguous, and when there are no rules for the specific case in question. This is a tough moment for most game masters. We could pause the session and look up the specific rule, but then we will stop the flow of the game. We could delegate this responsibility to someone else in the group, but that will only help if the problem is that we're not familiar with a specific rule, and not if the rules are unclear or non-existent. In some cases, we will have to rely on our own judgment and make a decision. In those cases, there are a few things that we need to consider. Here are some guidelines aimed at helping you make sure you've considered your decision in depth. First, consider the impact the decision will have on the game. Ask yourself, if I allow this action, will that break the balance of the game? Will it ruin the way we play? And of course, will it stop the game from being fun? This might require that we think ahead a bit, and oftentimes, not all repercussions will be obvious from the get-go. But on many occasions, this approach will allow us to see immediately that some rulings just won't work for our specific game. Second guideline, consider the principles of the game system. Many game systems are built around basic principles or concepts. If something violates these principles, it is probably not a good idea to allow it in your game. In D&D, every class has specialized features. So an artifact that allows one class to gain the same abilities as another will probably hinder your game. Why? Because it will make some characters obsolete. Another example of going against the principles of the game would be mixing genres. A player that wants their familiar to be an AI robot that shoot lasers out of their eyes, that's actually kind of cool. But in a high fantasy game, it will likely clash with the setting. Going against game principles is not necessarily a bad thing, but doing so requires thought and planning, and should be done deliberately. The third guideline is to consider the goal of your game. If your goal is to have short collaborative storytelling fun, then one player being overpowered probably won't matter. The Avengers work well together as a group, despite the fact that they have very varied power levels. However, if you're playing a by-the-book D&D adventure, one of your goals is probably to overcome obstacles as a group, and power gaps will hinder the collaborative efforts in doing so. So, when considering whether to allow or disallow a specific action that you don't know the rule for, or that the game mechanics do not cover, remember to consider how the action impacts the game system principles, and your goal. One of the tools that I use to deal with these questions is called the one-time pass. If a player asks to perform an action that is really cool, but that I'm afraid might cause problems if done repeatedly, I'll let it happen for this session and make a final decision later on. My typical reply is, that's a cool idea, so I'll allow it for now, but I'll have to research and double check before you ever do that again. This lets the player enjoy the original idea, but saves me the trouble of considering all future ramification mid-session. The purpose of the one-time pass is to allow and encourage ideas without committing to a ruling. Imagine this: you're at a tense moment in your game, and it's important for you to keep going to maintain the tension. But then you need to make a rule decision. If you will start an extended rule search or a lengthy discussion, the moment will be ruined. In order to keep the game going at this moment, I have instituted in my group a practice called the post-session discussion, or PSD. Whenever I say PSD after a ruling, that is my way of telling my players that I'm making a decision right now in order for the game to continue, and that we can discuss that decision once the session is over. It's important to actually follow up on that and have the discussion after the session. And if the conclusion is that a mistake was made during the on-the-fly ruling, amends must be made. For example, when one of my players came up with a clever way of using dragon scales to block an enemy wizard spell, I ruled against using that, but was convinced in the post-session discussion that it should have worked. So I rewarded that player with a single-use magical device based on those scales that block magical attacks, validating that their idea should have worked. In GMing, just like in any other field, owning up to our mistakes and fixing them help us improve ourselves. This is a great time to introduce a concept you might have heard about called the rule of cool. And I'll start by saying that the rule of cool is a concept, not an actual rule. The idea behind the rule of cool states that if something is cool and you want it in your game, let it. You can find the justification for it later on. We will usually encounter good opportunities to apply the rule of cool in two major areas. The first is in relation to the story we're telling. When we want something to happen, but it would be unrealistic or problematic in the story or setting. For example, it would be really cool if one of the characters would meet their old master at this moment, but we've already established that the old master is on the other side of the continent. The other scenario that presents an option to use the rule of cool is related to the rules of the game. Namely, when we want something to happen, but it is in contrast with some game mechanics. I had a game where it would have been great if I could have placed all of the player characters inside a dark room where they couldn't see what was around them. But some characters could see in the dark and others could create magical lights. But because that scene would have been so cool, I decided to let it happen. How did I do that? By using a tool called retro-justification. Retro-justification simply means we do whatever is needed for the scene to take place and find the justification for it later on. When I told my players that they find themselves in a dark room and can't see, they immediately said things like, "I can see in the dark, I create lights." But I told them that none of those features worked. They still couldn't see because it was needed for the scene. Later on, after the session was done, I thought and thought till I came up with a way to justify it in order for the game world to remain consistent. I decided that the darkness was mental, a magical effect on their mind that cut off their vision rather than actually shrouding the environment in darkness. That worked well with both the theme of my adventure and the rules of the game. You can practice retro-justification by thinking about an illogical situation and then trying to come up with several explanations to why it happened. For example, there is a goblin army led by a small human child. How could that be? Pause the video here and try to come up with a reason. Here are some ideas that I have. The child is actually a polymorph dragon or a magician. The goblins adopted the child and he is their mascot. The child has taken the famous goblin sword out of the famous goblin stone and is now the king of the goblins. The trick is to come up with many different solutions to practice thinking outside the box. Here are some other odd situations you can practice retro-justification on. Feel free to pause the video after each prompt and practice, or refer to the resource for this lesson later. The prompts live there too. One of the characters in the party can suddenly fly. Why? A character that has never done so before suddenly cooks an amazing meal. Why? The party meets a 10-year-old version of their fighter. How? Making your game cool and awesome is a goal unto itself. Remember that the rule of cool can be applied to your ideas or to ideas brought up by your players. If one of my players wants to purchase a purple worm as a mount, I could point out that they can't be ridden or purchased or trained. But if it will make my game cooler without compromising the integrity of the setting, I'll let it happen. In this lesson, we talked about making rulings on the fly mid-session. We discussed how to use the post-session discussion to make sure we and our players are on the same page regarding our decisions. And finally, we explored the rule of cool and how to use retro-justification to make sure that our game world remain consistent despite on-the-fly elements that might not make immediate sense. This is the end of this lesson. Next, we will be talking about how and when to end your gaming session. See you soon.